Okay, well, I've put the record button on to start the event, and I'm hoping everyone can see and hear me okay. Please let me know if you can't. I just want to ask you, please, because I think we'll be a big crowd, and if you could make sure to mute during the talk and when you're not speaking yourself, that would be great. I've also put the live captions on, which you can access if you wish. So that's entirely your choice. Okay, well, welcome everyone to the Centre for Visual Cultures at Royal Holloway. I'm aware that there are many of you, in fact, who are not from the college, who are guests from, I think, around the country. And I want to say a special hello to the Holocaust Exhibition and Learning Centre at the University of Huddersfield, who were in touch earlier this week. It's great to have you here. And I believe also members of Hilary's family are also here, which is great. So welcome, everyone. I'm the director of the centre, James Williams. And it's great to welcome you to this 78th anniversary talk of the Rosenstrasse protest in Berlin in 1943. For those who don't know Hilary, I'm going to just do a short introduction. Dr. Hilary Potter is a teaching fellow in German in the School of Humanities up here at Royal Holloway. Before that, she worked at the universities of Cardiff, Leeds and Newcastle. She's the author of the monograph Remembering Rosenstrasse, History, Memory and Identity in Contemporary Germany, published by Peter Lang in 2018. She's currently working on an exhibition with Mark Epstein of Edge Hill University, who is here. Welcome, Mark. Entitled Weimar 1919 to 1933, Dancing on a Volcano, exploring the resonances between the present and Germany's first democracy. She's also working on the transnational TV series Babylonian Berlin, about which she spoke, in fact, at a talk last night at the Department of Languages, Literatures, Cultures here at Royal Holloway. And 2 articles, I believe, are in production on that project. So welcome, Hilary, and welcome also to Simone Gigliotti, who has very kindly agreed to lead the Q&A. Dr. Simone Gigliotti is Senior Lecturer in Holocaust Studies here in the School of Humanities and is affiliated with the Holocaust Research Institute. Her research focuses on the victim and survivor experience in oral, written, visual, and geographic accounts, and how these accounts often intersect with and differ from perpetrator, humanitarian, and other witnessing perspectives. She's the author of the landmark monograph, A Train Journey, Transit, Captivity, and Witnessing in the Holocaust, published by Berghahn in 2009, and is the co-editor of numerous volumes, and I just mention a few. The Young Victims of the Nazi Regime, Migration, the Holocaust and Post-War Displacement, Bloomsbury 2016. The Memorialization of Genocide, Routledge 2017, and most recently, I think these were both last year, the Blackwell Companion to the Holocaust and the Holocaust in the 21st Century, Relevance and Challenges in the Digital Age, published by Northwestern University Press. So it's a great pleasure to have both Hilary and Simone here and all of you to be part of this anniversary talk. And the title of the talk is Visualizing Palimpsestic Memories of the Berlin Rosenstrasse Protest, 1943, through the medium of photography. Over to you, Hilary.
Thank you, James. I'd also like to extend my welcome and thank you for coming today. And I'd like to extend my thanks to Mark Epstein, my partner in crime and all other things. But also he's a tutor at Edge Hill and also a professional photographer. And we have him to thank for the fact that this PowerPoint got put together so well. He's been tremendously helpful. And the fact that I'm here in one piece because he made lunch while I was busy trying to get everything together at the last minute because it's been a slightly hectic week. Before I begin talking about this topic of the Rosenstrasse protest and its commemoration, its memorialization, I'd like to first begin by welcoming Trudy and Danny, if he's here, because if I can make my PowerPoint work, I'm dedicating this lecture to the memory of Professor Ian Wallace, who was a great scholar, an expert in the GDR, and an all-round lovely human being who sadly passed away recently. He was known to many of us in German studies, and he helped launch more than a few academic careers in his time. He was my lecturer and my personal tutor in my undergraduate days, and up until his retirement, that is. But he remained in contact, heartily encouraged my research, and even read the book proposal and an early draft of the manuscript for the book, on which sort of this lecture is partly based. Ian was always kind, generous with his knowledge. He was supportive and encouraging. He had a knack of reassuring anxious undergrad students about their exam performance, for example. He'd let them know the paper he'd just read was good, and you could tell by the twinkle in his eye and the raising of the eyebrows that he was talking about yours. As well as being generous and insightful, he was humorous at every given opportunity. I always remember him as smiling. I can't think of an occasion when he didn't. So it seems only fitting that in his memory, we aspire to emulate the kindness, the generosity, the encouragement, and the humour wherever possible. And let's let that be a fitting legacy. Thank you very much. So, taking that forward and being generous with my knowledge, let's begin our topic for today. Why are we talking about Rosenstrasse now, and why photography? Rosenstrasse is a seemingly insignificant side street in central Berlin. And 78 years ago, almost to the day, Saturday in fact, there began in that street what became known as the Rosenstrasse protest. This was a protest against the arrest and feared deportation of somewhere around 2,000 intermarried German Jews, that is, individuals who are of Jewish heritage, or as the Nazis define them, Jewish heritage, because Nazi definition of who was Jewish differs from Jewish theology. So individual German Jews who are married to Christian or atheist Germans, and also those of mixed Judeo-Christian parentage, who the Nazis termed Mischlinge. It's a derogatory term to describe the fact that they came from a mixed background. Supposedly, those who were intermarried or who came from a mixed Judeo-Christian heritage were exempt from deportation. They weren't exempt from persecution, but apparently, according to the rules, or according to what the Nazis said, they wouldn't deport them. But there remained question marks over whether this would actually be the case, or whether some would be deported anyway. And it remained disputed for the entirety of the Third Reich, with certain key Nazi figures who wanted to forcibly break intermarriages and deport all German Jews. But it didn't, in fact, happen. During this protest, predominantly we're talking about women being protesting on the street. It wasn't an exclusively female demonstration, but it was predominantly female, owing to the makeup of the number of intermarriages in Germany that at that time tended to be a Jewish man married to a non-Jewish woman. But there were also men held in Rosenstrasse and men amongst the protesters. Now, these arrests did not happen in isolation. They were part of a wider, what was known as a roundup or a razzia of Berlin Jews who had up until that point been used as slave laborers, predominantly in the armaments factories. But the people that were held in Rosenstrasse, those who were intermarried, were held separately for the most part, and they were held in a former office building that once belonged to the Jewish community on Rosenstrasse, which is in the center of Berlin, and I will show you where it is in a minute. Now, there are many things that are disputed about this protest, not least its form. Some testimonies claim that there was chanting, and demanding. Others claimed it was silent or near silent, that people were just gathered there, not knowing what to do. Other testimonies yet still claimed that the protesters were threatened with violence if they didn't leave the street. We don't know, and it's much disputed, whether the protest was successful. And in many ways, it doesn't matter whether it was successful or not. Success isn't really a measure here for judging and assessing the protest. But what is known, and what we do know for certain, is that all of the detainees were, I say, released. That doesn't mean that they were free. They actually, for the most part, continued as slave or forced labourers in and around Berlin, but they were not deported, save for 25 men who were initially deported to the labour camp at Auschwitz, but a fortnight later transferred back, not to freedom, but to another camp out on the outskirts of Berlin, where they served as forced labourers until the end of the war, but their wives were permitted access to go and visit them. There are also a minority of what were called Klärungsfällen. So these were what they call cases where the intermarriage might have been breaking down, and had the marriage broken down, the Nazis would have deported the Jewish individual. So some of these people were detained for up to 6 weeks, and the most famous being the publicist Heinz Ullstein of the Ullstein Verlag. But the majority of the people detained in Rosenstrasse were released within a few days to a week. And the protests sort of ebbed and flowed throughout this time. It's obviously overnight it was smaller, but it grew in size in the day, and it remained constant for that week. The vast majority then of the people detained in Rosenstrasse survived the Third Reich. Some went into hiding in the latter stages of the war, but the majority survived. And the protesters never faced any action for the protest, which was, of course, illegal in Nazi Germany at the time. Now, patterns of remembrance. What happened after the war? Was this simply forgotten? In all honesty, remembrance of the protesters ebbed and flowed over time. There was initially some interest in it in 1945 and in the years following, but then it sort of declined as other historical narratives took over. And it was then largely forgotten until the 1980s, and then more so from the 1990s. And what's interesting in particular is a lot of the impetus to remember the events came from what was then the GDR, what was then East Germany. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through this talk and talk about the memorials. And in the years since then, Rosenstrasse has become a central point of remembrance at this time of year, and is now an annual point in the commemorative calendar. Now, ordinarily, at some point in the next few days, there would be a ceremony in the street with prayers and speeches, but obviously this year with the pandemic, that's not possible. But there is a virtual ceremony, and later on I'll put a link to that in the chat. It's starting at 10 o'clock German time tomorrow, 9 o'clock our time. So if you're up and you can understand German and want to watch it, you'll be able to do so, to watch it live. And I'm going to try and watch it live as well, because I've never actually been present at the ceremony, and I would be really fascinated to see what happens. So then, why does talking about this past matter? Why does understanding history matter? I would say it is about understanding the processes, how history is made, who shapes it, why, and to what ends, what is forgotten and what is remembered anew. Understanding the process of history means we can understand about the priorities of contemporary society, the values that matter now. It can also keep us alert, help us to recognise patterns and look for and spot any recurrence of the past, of fascism, however tangential they may be, but they may be in our midst. And part of that is looking at memorialisation, because for as much as memorials are seemingly fixed, immovable objects, in fact, that's not the case. Their relevance changes, as does their engagement with them. And we might think of the recent toppling of Edward Colston's memorial statue as an example of how impermanent a memorial actually is. Also, memorials, and I'm using this term as an umbrella term because in German there are different terms for different types of memorials, and we'll come to that in the Q&A. Memorials don't have just one meaning. They can be interpreted in different ways and at different times and to different ends. And in fact, the Holocaust scholar James E. Young talks about the monument or the memorial as being actually the best memorial to the Holocaust is actually talking. It is not something hewn out of stone. Also, memorials allow us to see moments captured in time, and this is partly where the photography comes in as well, because I'll get you to think about how the memorials that we're looking at this afternoon are not only representative of the past, but that they can also speak to the here and now. You've got to hang in to the end for that bit. So lastly then, for this section at least, why photography? Several reasons, not just because CVC asked me to give a lecture and I thought, what can I do? But that obviously is part of it. But why photography? Well, several reasons really. We're going to be using photography as the means today of taking you to Berlin. I'm going to use some screen grabs of maps just to give you some orientation, some digitized archive images to sort of give you a historical sense of Rosenstrasse, and a number of recent photographs, some from 2016 and some from 2020. They're mostly Mark's, so we must thank Mark for letting us use his photos, and a few of them are mine. And so this is how we hadn't envisaged when we took these photos last January that we would be using them for this purpose. We just took them out of interest, but we're hoping that I'm going to be able to sort of walk you around the memorials through the medium of photography. But that's not the only reason why we're using photography today, because photographs also play a legitimizing role in historical narratives, and in this narrative in particular, even though actually and ironically, there's no known photograph of the Rosenstrasse protest. There are rumors that one exists, but none has ever been found. But as you'll see, as you look at some of the memorials, photographs are central. Photographs can also help us challenge accepted aspects of the narrative. And again, we'll talk through some of that in the Q&A because I don't want to dive too deep into the details just yet. Then, of course, there are questions of ethics, of how photographs are used, the ethics of creating an idea of a truth, because photographs are believed. There's that old saying of the camera never lies. And I know we've got photography students in on this call who will say, actually, no, sometimes the camera does. Or perhaps that the camera or the photograph derives its meaning from the text and the context in which it is set. So there are ethical questions about usage of photography. And of course, then there's a question of photographic agency, of how photographs are used and how the individual interacts with them, that they help to make a connection, help you imagine what it might have been like at that time. And that is particularly how they're used in some of the memorial and the exhibition in particular. So the photos are going to help us trace the multiple histories in this street, not just the protest itself, but the histories going back through time and then forwards through time since the protest. We'll look at the history of the protest Remembrance through photography. And we'll examine in particular the memorial sculpture, looking for the forgotten or hidden stories within it. What do we see? What don't we see? And then towards the end, we've got a number of photos that are snapshots in time that perhaps tell us something about contemporary Germany or raise questions at least. And so we'll be using those as our jumping off point for our discussion, but we're using them photos generally with the idea of the urban palimpsest. Now, the palimpsest might be a new term to you. Basically, what it means in its original form, a palimpsest is the traces of writing. So if you imagine an old manuscript and you can see writing, but underneath you can see faint writing of an earlier time. So writing that has been written over and over and over, but you can trace it back by examining it. You can do the same thing with a cityscape or indeed a street. You can look at the different histories that are present in that one particular urban space and look to see what you can find. So that's the sort of broad sweep of how this lecture is going to go, how the story is going to go. Do feel free to put questions in the chat in the meantime. Mark's also helpfully monitoring the chat as best he can. And we will come to sort of questions as we sort of get there. And I'm going to set you a few tasks, a few things to think about as I'm talking. But first of all, I'm going to take a sip of water. But let me try and transport you to Berlin. At this moment in time, still in lockdown, people might have itchy feet, and I know I would really quite like to go to Rosenstrasse in person right now and to Berlin, but I can't. But let's just imagine for a second we're in Berlin. This is Rosenstrasse. The building you see in the background may look like a historical building. In actual fact, it's a rebuild from the 1990s to look like something from around the 1800s, but more on that later, perhaps. What you can see here, and actually I apologize, it looks incredibly small on this computer. It didn't when I was making it, is a screen grab of Berlin, courtesy of a Berlin map, courtesy of Google. Thank you, Google. And I'm showing you this just to give you a sense of how central Rosenstrasse is. So for those of you that are familiar with Berlin, you might already be picking up some of the landmarks. But if you look sort of to the left-hand side by the green space, you can see the Brandenburg Gate, the iconic symbol of Berlin. You take a short walk, by which I mean a couple of kilometers, towards the east and to the perhaps more well-known Alexanderplatz, the big square in the east, the big TV tower. And just over the road from there is Rosenstrasse. So it really is central Berlin. And here's another perspective for you to look at, this time courtesy of a satellite image, again courtesy of Google. So we're right there in sort of East Berlin with our TV tower, so subsequently there. But if you look to the bottom left quarter of that image, you can see the Marienkirche, the church down there. Back at the time of the protest, Rosenstrasse was a much longer street. It had a tram line running down it as well, and it reached almost to that the church doors. But after the reconstruction of East Berlin, the street was substantially shortened. But it just gives you a perspective of how big, or rather small, it was, but also how central. And the building that we're talking about is no longer there. It was bombed, but it's just on the sort of middle corner of that picture on the left-hand side. Middle corner? The middle on the left-hand side of that picture is where it would be. And the memorial we're talking about is just there on the left in the middle. But I grant you that is really teeny tiny. I don't imagine you can see it on the screen. But let's go from our bird's eye view down to the ground. You've also just travelled back to May 2016. And what you can see here is Rosenstrasse as it is, or as it was 4 years ago. Behind those trees is the building, or the site of the building that was the centre of this protest, the former Jewish community building. It's now been rebuilt and as an office block, and the only original building on that street is just at the end, number 1. It's now a hotel. Where you see the trees, that's approximately where Berlin's first synagogue stood. It was technically on Heidereutergasse, which is an adjacent street, but cornered with Rosenstrasse. So we're in the heart of Berlin, and we're in the heart of Jewish Berlin. And this is a sketch of the said synagogue, consecrated in 1714, my apologies. And it became known as the Alte Synagogue, or the Old Synagogue, once the much larger synagogue opened in Oranienburger Straße, a few streets away. However, it remained a house of worship until 1942, until the Nazis closed it. It was bombed at some point in the latter stages of the war, and for about 20 years it remained an empty shell. And then it was then pulled down sometime in the 60s to make way for that urban replanning in the GDR times. And that area was actually left as pretty much a kind of disused green space, which is, well, I'll get to why the memorial is where it is shortly. And now you've gone back further in time, and we're at 1896. And this is a photograph by the photographer Georg Bartels. And this is Rosenstrasse as similar to the way it would have been when the protest took place. The building where the detainees were held, where the intermarried German Jews were held, it was this one here. So if you go to the right-hand side of the screen and 3 rooftops in, that is the building there. And again, you can see it's a very narrow street. So try and imagine that rammed with people inside the building and people outside the building, to give you a sense of how crowded this protest must have been. And this is the final of my archive shots. This is the building on Rosenstrasse, sort of in the late 1930s, early 1940s. Interestingly, this photograph was taken by a photographer called Abraham Pisarek, who subsequently ended up as one of the detainees within that building, and then later survived the war. And it's thanks to his daughter that we have access to this photograph. Now, what you see in there, right on the right-hand side of the image, and a further one sort of left of centre in the image, are 2 columns known as Litfaßsäulen, after Ernst Litfaß, who created them. They're advertising columns. So normally they would have posters, advertising, shows, or whatever pasted on them. In testimonies of the protest, then, these Litfaßsäulen, these columns appear, particularly when people who've been children at the time of the protest were recounting their memories, and they talk about hiding behind them, so looking up to the windows without the guards seeing them, trying to catch a glimpse of their mother or their father detained within the building. And this photograph has been used and reused and become synonymous with the protest, but also those columns play an important role, because one of the memorials we'll look at is based on that column. It takes that idea and that association with those columns and the testimony as its form for a basic exhibition in the street today. And I'll show you a picture of that in a little while. So hopefully you're now feeling a little bit sort of more orientated into Berlin and into Rosenstrasse. And I'd like to begin talking about the first of the memorials to the protest, as we call it. And I'll just give you a bit of background, and then I'm going to walk you through it, but not say too much, because I want you to be thinking and viewing, and not to try and overly steer your interpretations, because I'm going to tell you what I think afterwards. Now, the sculpture was created by Ingeborg Hunzinger, a renowned artist and sculptor in East Germany. She had a complicated relationship with the East German state. She was quite critical of it. At times, she was given quite a lot of artistic freedom. Other times, she was more restricted. But in the latter years of the GDR, she had become quite critical of the state, and particularly the absence of any memorial to the Holocaust, Jewish suffering. Now, at the same time, what was going on in the GDR is there was actually a turn towards looking at the GDR's Nazi past, its Jewish past, for varying reasons. And I think, just conscious of time, I won't go into them here, but I'll talk about those in the Q&A later. But there was with this interest that was building into the Nazi past, there was a greater sort of reception at state level for projects around sort of that engaged with Jewish history. And Ingeborg Hunzinger put forward a project for the sculpture, which received funding in the summer of 1989. So you kind of get what I'm thinking. This is not long before the states, or the demise, should we say, the fall of the Berlin Wall, obviously Germany's unification a year later in 1990. So what happened to the sculpture? Obviously it was realized, but therein lies a bit of a battle. Hunzinger had created her sculpture, but for several years, sort of getting it actually on site was a struggle and looked like it might not happen. Ingeborg Hunzinger did not want her sculpture to be hidden out of sight. She wanted it on display for the public, but also to jolt the public and make them think and make them question and recognize this Nazi past and the Jewish past. Now, once Germany was unified, various laws came into being, which meant that the ground where Ingeborg Hunzinger has ultimately been able to display the sculpture reverted to its original ownership of the Jewish community. And in the early 1990s, the Jewish community were thinking about how they could use this space, and they wanted to put a building on there, so perhaps an old people's home. But ultimately, and they offered Ingeborg Hunsinger the chance to put her memorial sculpture in a sort of central little courtyard bit, but she didn't want it to be out of sight of the general public. Ultimately, though, the Jewish community gifted the land to the city of Berlin because of building regulations. When you come to look at the photos, what you will see is that all around that area, there's high-rise buildings, sort of in there, and some of them are office buildings, but there's also sort of ordinary dwellings. And any building in that space would have restricted light to those flats, which meant that nothing could be built on there. So the Jewish community decided to gift the land to the city, and Ingeborg Hunsinger was then able to have her sculpture installed on what was the site of the former synagogue, and that all happened in October 1995. So we kind of think that, you know, what we remember about the past is always sort of political, and to a certain extent there is a lot of political involvement in the installation of a memorial. But what we remember, or what we are able to remember and have recognized, sometimes comes down to sort of the smallest of details that you wouldn't imagine. But because of those small details, we are able to recognize this part of Germany's past. And Ingeborg Hunsinger's sculpture has ultimately provided a gateway for all the memorials and initiatives that have followed. So I'm sure you'd now like to see it. Hang on, my screen's frozen. Perfect timing. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to slowly click you through these. I'm going to give you a few pointers for things to think about, to sort of drill down into the photos so that you can pick up on things. But I'm not going to talk too much, because I would like you to start drawing your own impressions, and then we can really bring those out in the Q&A. But this memorial sculpture, just a couple of sort of factual details. It's made out of a stone called red porphyry, which erodes gradually over time. And it's in 5 blocks, in 5 sections, should we say, or blocks, because it's called a Block der Frauen, or the women's block. And these are spread across the sort of the green space, the land of the former synagogue. And I'm going to just move through them sort of left to right for no other reason than that's just, you've got to look at it one way or the other. So we're going to start on the left-hand side, nearest to Alexanderplatz. And the first block that we come to, we see a musician. Note that the violin he's holding in the one hand appears broken, disjointed, as does the bow in his other hand. Look at his face. Look at his gaze. Where is he looking? What does that impression tell you? Look again. This is just a profile view of him. Looking, where is his gaze going? Oh, someone else is taking control of the presentation. I'm going to take it back. Can you please not do that, because it'll cause it to crash? Look at where he's looking. What does that expression say to you? What does it make you think of? This is the reverse of that same block. So you can see it's quite small and sort of oddly shaped in one respect. And we have this depiction here of what is perhaps, it's said to be a depiction of Babylonian exile. So we've got the contemporary persecution, but then tied in with the long ancient history of Jewish persecution. And if we zoom in, we can see that face. What does that face say to you? That holding the head in the hands, what does it perhaps remind you of? If we come back to the other side of that little block, we've got a man bending over. He seems to have a book in his hand, but his head is resting and his gaze is looking away. In actual fact, it's looking away from the entire sculpture. It's looking towards the other street. That is supposed to be a philosopher. So why is the philosopher looking away from what's going on? What does that say to us? Now we come to the central blocks, and you'll notice that there's quite a lot of green. There's sort of like a lot of moss and algae and whatever on them, and I'll talk about why in a minute. But we can see various sort of Jewish symbols here, and various different scenes that are going on, and we're going to look at them a little more closely. If we come to this end, we have the shrouded figure. We can deduce that this is a Jewish figure by the star that's above it, and the figure is shrouded, and all we know, we can see the eyes and the hands, but there's no other way of determining the gender of this particular figure. But we intuit that this is about death, about loss of Jewish life. If we come to the reverse, take a look at the top of that block and down on the left-hand side. If you look closely, again, we've got repeated motifs, but also it looks as if these sections are perhaps ornate, but look again more closely and they look like they're broken bits, perhaps from other buildings. Perhaps this is symbolizing the destruction of Jewish property. And then we come to the couple here. They look as if they're hewn out of the one stone, the same stone. What does that represent? What does that symbolize? Then if we move to the right-hand side, we've got a number of bodies squashed together in a very confined space. They're all at different angles, and we've got a very small figure, perhaps a child or a small person at the bottom. What does this all represent? And if we look in more closely, we can see the agonizing look on their faces. This one here being squashed. There's an arm potentially here and a head here. What is it making, asking the viewer or the visitor to think of? This then is the side of the block, and you'll notice it's very jagged, but unnaturally so. This isn't the result of a natural erosion. It's as if someone has taken, I don't know, a sledgehammer to it and broken it up. It's an unnatural break. What was Hunsinger trying to suggest with this? I'm not saying I have all the answers. This is just things for you to think about and we can discuss. I have some suggestions, obviously. Then we come to this block. We've got what we believe are the protesters huddled together, looking in different directions. Their faces of exhaustion, perhaps, of anguish, of sorrow, of uncertainty, of shock. We've got the woman with her mouth open there. And their gaze, where is their gaze going at this point? What are they looking at? Arguably, they're looking at this. This is the central block. It's two women supporting one another, physically, but also emotionally. We can see the sort of the empty, anguished look on this woman's face. She's looking upwards, heavenwards, perhaps for inspiration, or just staring into the distance, cradling the other woman in her hands or in her arms. And we see the second woman here, her head bowed with exhaustion, with despair, taking physical support and comfort from the person she's with. And then what's happening in the background, we can't in this image see what's just to the sort of like the middle behind them. But if we look to the right hand side, we can see a woman, her fist is clenched. Or is it clenched? We'll see when we get closer up. But what's she looking at, or who is she looking at? She's looking at him. So we see this figure, but look behind him first. We've got faces trapped somewhere in something that's broken down, but hemming them in. And our man here is still partly attached, but he's also freeing himself. He's striving to pull away. What does this signify? He's striving towards her. Now, look for a moment, and let's look at her face closely. You'll notice that the forehead, the eyes, the nose, they're all quite clearly defined. But if you look at her ear, it almost looks like cauliflower ear, or it's indistinguishable. It wasn't like that a few years ago, but that's because this stone is designed to erode naturally over time. And Hunsinger's idea was that this monument, this memorial, this sculpture would erode over time, much as memories do erode over time as time passes and people pass. So that's why you can see, you know, this memorial isn't, this sculpture isn't maintained. It's left, you know, it gets covered in moss and whatever else here. So that's why she has a greenish face. And also the birds do their own artistic additions, shall we call them. So in this particular instance, you know, there's bird poo everywhere, but it's there because memorials are in the here and now. There's not someone going around every day cleaning it. It's just left to the elements. And we might want to think about that a little bit more and about why. And as I said, you know, her career is still not wonderfully defined there. This is a picture from 4 years earlier, but what we can see, again, she's surrounded by symbolism, but she's beckoning. That hand is curled as if to say, come to me, come here. I want to protect you. So she's symbolizing that unity of intermarried couples. If we look at the reverse of those two blocks, then we can see there's a hand here on the top left-hand side. What does that symbolize? Is that a hand someone trying to escape? Is that a hand? Is it dying? Below, we've got two smaller figures, presumably children. Again, if you look, you see sort of sadness on their face, huddled together in solidarity. And then we have an inscription, 1943, and what it basically says is the power of disobedience overcomes the power of the dictatorship. And then onto the next block, we've got this sort of quasi-crucifixion image. So we've got Judeo-Christian imagery here with our man here, our emaciated man, his ribcage protruding, but his hands held up, partly as if he's straining away, but partly as if he's being crucified. Above it, we've got the words, "Gib uns unsere Männer wieder," give us our husbands back, which is reputedly what the protesters shouted at the guards. And then it says, "Women stood here, death-defying, and Jewish men were free." Why is this on the stone? Why is that the inscription? What is it telling us? Hang on a second. And then we come to the final section. This is our man on a bench, and there's a funny little anecdote. Way back when I started this PhD, or as it was then, I had some not quite so good photographs, and I was looking at them in the office with some of my office mates, and I said, "Yeah, but what does?" You could see him; he was really, really small in this photograph. I said, "And what about this bit here?" And my office mate went, "Oh, that's just a man on a bench." And I thought, "Oh yeah, you're right. I've obviously misremembered. That's not part of the sculpture." But he is. He's very much a part of the sculpture, but he's set apart. So why is he set apart? What is he looking at? What does that distance symbolize? Then look again and look behind him. You've got a building behind you. That is the building that replaced the former Jewish community building. It's a series of offices. So what is it like for the people who work in there to work in a space where there's this weight of history, where they look out and see the scenes going on, see how people interact with this particular site? It's quite interesting when you go around and you stand there and you watch how tourists or just visitors interact with it. And then, of course, here's a close-up of his face. And I'd just like to thank that bird for the strategic bird poo teardrop. But we just thought we'd show you this to show that, you know, the memorials, they're not sort of sanctified, untouchable, unengageable being, rather that they're there in the here and now, and they're part of our everyday, and how we and how nature engage with them is something that we can reflect on and think about and try and understand. So I'm going to pause the pictures there for a minute, because I'll be really interested to hear your thoughts in the Q&A about what all this memorial mean, these sculptures mean, what things you see that perhaps I don't, coming at it with different eyes. You see different things. I know every time I've been to that memorial, I see different things I hadn't spotted before, because there's so much in there. But what I'd like to do at this point is put forward an idea. about the sculpture and about the events it represents and its hidden history, that its history is hidden and simultaneously sort of submerged, but it's there if we look at it and read it in context. I would suggest that what Hunsinger was doing with his sculpture is critiquing remembrance culture. So remembrance culture in the GDR, but perhaps also remembrance culture of Germany as a unified state, and particularly the tendency to mourn the German, that is the non-Jewish loss. If we think to those outlying blocks, we've got the musician on the left-hand side and our man on the bench on the right-hand side. They're looking, the musician is looking away and the man is looking on at perhaps what has already passed. And there is perhaps a sense that they are mourning their loss, not the loss of Jewish life, but in music, representing culture, the loss of Jewish contribution to German culture, if you like. So perhaps that is what Hunsinger was critiquing. In a broader context as well, if we think about the reverse of those bigger blocks, Hunsinger was reminding the visitor that even though a small number of people survived the Holocaust, and there was this protest which did possibly or possibly didn't enable those inside Rosenstrasse to survive, but we can never detach that history from its broader history. We can never forget about the Holocaust that was going on around it, and that even whilst people were protesting on the streets for these individuals, no one else was protesting against the far greater number who were being deported. And in a way, Hunsinger's memorial sort of anticipates later historiographical trends, but again, we'll come to that in the Q&A if there's more time. And yet, there's also a GDR aspect that, the fact that the history of this memorial's development and the role of the GDR in that is perhaps significant in the protest remembrance, but this is an aspect that is overlooked and forgotten. And in a way, I'd like to suggest that Rosenstrasse is potentially a microcosm for the wider patterns of remembering and memorialization in Berlin generally. If we kind of go out of Rosenstrasse just for a minute, just indulge me, and we go a few streets away, we've now got the it's possibly now finished City Palace, or a replacement building for the palace that was once there and then destroyed. But on that site, there was the East German regime's Palast der Republik, or Palace of the Republic, and it became an iconic building associated with the GDR that then got taken down and removed. But the palace that's in its place just it obliterates any trace of that GDR past. In fairness, there is reference to it buried within the basement of the new palace, so I believe, but again, it's not visible to the viewer, to the visitor just walking past. So my question is the GDR's past being written out to a certain extent, and is Rosenstrasse then perhaps a smaller representative of that greater whole? That's something to perhaps mull over. Now, when Hunsinger's sculpture was unveiled in 1995, the events themselves weren't as well known as they are today. And one of the criticisms of her memorial was that no one would know what it was about. Now, you could take the line that, well, it's art, it's interpretive. So really, do you need something that tells you what to think? What is this? What is about this? And you might also think there's quite a lot of symbolism in there. People can work it out. As a sort of means of going against that critique or redressing that critique, the hotel owner Wolfgang Lock, who owns the hotel and also the office buildings, was very conscious of wanting to make that past very present and to honour that past, to honour what happened in the street, to honour the women's protests and the suffering of those in Rosenstrasse. And so he commissioned the memorial plaque you can now see on your screen. And the eagle-eyed amongst you will have already noticed that that same picture I showed you earlier, Abraham Pisarek's photo of Rosenstrasse, forms half of that plaque. And below is a short description of the events in their wider context. And what we have here, and this is where photography plays a part in constructing this narrative, is that use of photography to help jolt you out of the everyday. So you could walk past and see that, and suddenly you can be transported back into an earlier point of time. It disrupts the everyday, and it makes Rosenstrasse, that seemingly insignificant street, into what Pierre Nora has called a lieu de mémoire, or a site of memory. And it helps you to sort of visualize what happened here, to imagine another world. Now, following year, so that Wolfgang Lock put that up in 1998, and then the following year, in the March of 1999, the Topography of Terror Museum installed this advertising column. Now, you'll remember, if we look back just to that previous slide, I talked about these advertising columns. They use the same style. They researched the style of Litfaßsäulen, or advertising column, and use this as the basis for their exhibition stroke their memorial. And dotted on there, we have numerous images. So we've got what you can't quite see in this image, is that's a station, that's Grunewald station, and Puttlitzbrücke is around the other side, stations from which deportations of Berlin Jews took place. Now, the photographs are actually post-war photographs, but perhaps their usage there is not just sort of practical, this is a photograph we have that's approximately the right time, but also it's alluding to that sort of absences that, so if you've read Roland Barthes' comments on discussion on photography, you talk about, you know, photographs being there to provide an absence of what is no longer here, but what has passed. And if you read sort of J.J. Long's works, he also talks about photographs gaining meaning from their context. So what you have where you don't have photographs is you have testimonies, one of which is actually fictional, masquerading as fact, even though it was known to the museum at the time that this is a fictional account. But you also have deportation lists you've got down here. You have testimony of survivors. You have testimony of Nazis, or accounts from serving Nazi officers at that time. And key among there then is this image. So it's that repeated image of being in the street at the time. But what you will notice in comparison to Ingeborg Hunzinger's sculpture is this little bit here on the right-hand side, left-hand side, sorry, terrible left-right confusion. You can see it's peeling away. That's because this sculpture is maintained, this memory is maintained by the Topography of Terror. Those pictures are pasted on in the same way that advertising hoarding was pasted on back in the day. They're put on there every 3 to 4 months. So this is a maintained memory because it gets weather beaten and battered. And so that's then becomes a draw for people to come to the street and to learn more about the event. Obviously, that is for only people who speak German. There isn't any English translation on there. And that led as well to the excavation of the foundations of the former synagogue, the Alte Synagoge, which you can then see here in this information board. And you've got a little description, and that's in English, French, German, obviously, and Russian. So this process that began with Ingeborg Hunzinger's memorial has allowed various histories, overlapping histories, different histories, to come to the surface and to be remembered and to form part of the cityscape. And what you can see here in this image is the foundations of the synagogue that were just there, so that the Jewish past can be commemorated. Now, remember as well that I said about that criticism of the memorial, that there was not enough to explain what it was. That again has been redressed, and we have a number of these glass information boards here, again using photography to help legitimize the narrative and to show its continuity. So we've got a picture of a commemoration speech down there, and this tells you one interpretation of what that memorial means. And it tells you that in German and in English. So we might think about this, we've perhaps got a shift towards a more didactic remembering, instructing on what you should think, and taking that agency away from the individual. So there's lots of development over sort of the last sort of 25 years or so, I haven't done the maths, in the street, and it is a veritable site of memory. With you can spend quite a lot of time in there just unpacking things. But that leads me to the question, and I'm sort of wrapping this up, of whose memory is it anyway? You know, we're talking about, I've used terms here like Jewish memory, German memory, but actually, does it belong to any of us at all? And how do we interact with that space? It's a public space after all. And as I say, I spent quite a bit of time there, and I like to kind of observe what's going on, or I get talking to people. And back in 2016, when I was there, I was waiting. Actually, I've gone there partly to take photographs for my book, and I was sat there waiting for what ultimately became the money shot, as I call it, because it's on the cover of my book. And I was waiting for ages because there was a couple, and they'd sat down on the bench with our stone man, and they were having their lunch and having a lovely little chat and cuddled up together. And the man then reached over and grabbed our stone man on the knee, gave it a squeeze, and went, schöne Beine, or lovely legs. At which point I'm thinking, well, you know, can you grope a sculpture? Is this acceptable behavior? But then who am I to say what is and isn't acceptable? You know, should there be a prescribed way of how you engage with memorials, or not? Does it really matter? Should I have gone over and told him? Ultimately, I decided no. I was really just wanting them to move because I wanted a clear shot, and I got my wish in the end. But it's been sort of mulling over in my mind ever since. And then, of course, in a second, we're going to look at a few snapshots in time that I hope will lead to a productive discussion. But I also, before I do that, want to raise one more sort of question that around how the narrative might be being reshaped at the present time, because in Germany you've got the rise of the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, which is a populist right party, and they're very interested in the Rosenstrasse narrative. And a few years ago, at the annual commemorative speech, I analysed that speech, and it seems to suggest to me that in an attempt not to let the AfD challenge the memory of the Rosenstrasse, take it over and manipulate it for their own purposes, as they tried to do with the legacy of the 20th of July assassination attempt on Hitler, that actually those that are involved in the protest commemoration have inadvertently let themselves be influenced by them and have offered a kind of very reduced, simplistic remembering of Rosenstrasse. But perhaps, again, we can flesh that out in the discussions, because I want to give us plenty of time. We've just got a couple more images to go, and then I'll hand over to Simone. This is a shot from 2016. Again, our man on the bench. It was quite useful for lots of photography, more than I realised when I was taking the photographs. And you can see on that right-hand side that there is a newspaper and there's a book. You can't quite see from this angle what that book says, but you've got a translation down there about Islam condemns terrorism. So what's that doing there? I don't know the story. I happened to see it. It was left there, and I thought, take a photograph. It's a snapshot. What's going on? But it raises these questions of how do we engage with a public memorial space? Do people see it as a memorial? This is consecrated Jewish ground. Is there a religious symbolism to that being left there? We don't know. It's another hidden history that we're not necessarily able to unearth. And then at the same time as going around the memorials, I noticed this. You might have seen this on one of the earlier photographs of the big blocks. This is what's supposed to be one of the death marks, as I understand it. Death masks, sorry. But you'll notice in this picture, the eyes are in blue. They've been coloured in or drawn in. Perhaps this is a reference to alluding to the Nazi ideal Aryan, the blue eyes. They haven't actually pasted on blonde hair, but there's a reference there. Why are they doing that? Is it a way of amplifying the GDR past that people perhaps think is being forgotten, or is it critiquing the GDR past? Is it just vandalism? Again, we don't know. There are different stories there, but it's showing that people are engaging with memorials in a different way. And this is my last image. Again, you'll recall this is the image of the protesters. But what you will notice if you zoom in is 2 of them at least have had Hitler moustaches drawn on them. Why have they had them drawn on them? How do we respond to this? Is this anti-Semitic graffiti? Is it someone having a pop? Is it just someone having a very, perhaps just having a joke, but a very ill thought through one? Who did it? We don't know. But it all raises questions about history, and how we understand it. But it's also about who controls the narrative. We could just condemn this as an act of graffiti, as an act of violence against the memorial, and we could stand in sort of indignation, if you like, at the fact that people have done this. But let's remember also, this isn't a grave, this is a sculpture, this is a piece of art. It's not the same as desecrating a grave, perhaps. But so I come back to that question, who controls the narrative? And this is, I think, where it links into the here and now, because who controls the history we learn and how we understand our pasts and ourselves as a result? These are the questions that we can ask, that we can use photography to ask, and to look at history and the process of history to ask. And as we think about these past events, let's also think about who controls the narrative of the events we're living through now, and what will people in the future understand, and what does that say about us? I'd like to stop there. Thank you for listening. I'm going to hand over to Simone, who's now going to pose some questions, and then we're going to open the floor for further questions. Thank you very much. Simone, over to you.
Thank you, Hilary. Thank you for an excellent talk. I have a few questions, I guess, that relate to your presentation, and also as you were talking about the kind of coming into being of the site, and also the photography of the various sculptures. So one of the questions I have, and we can answer them after each question or open it up to the floor, it's up to you, but one relates to the microgeography and conceptions of microtime as instructive memory actions or engagements without formal commemoration reminders, because, as you said, tomorrow is the 78th anniversary. So I was interested in memory and remembrance outside of these regular markers, and what is the kind of function of, I guess, the site in its everyday space and engagements. How do you kind of conceive, have you researched, I guess, the kind of the everyday history outside of the commemoration frameworks?
Yes, largely. I mean, it's often there's sort of 2 arguments, if you like, that that having these memorials, and particularly things like the advertising columns that are very similar to the way they are now, but just ever so slightly different, that they jolt you out of the everyday. So there's this sort of raising of social consciousness that goes with them, and it makes you stop. You might be hurrying through that street, taking a shortcut, and you're confronted with the past rather than having to actively remember it, because there's also that argument that says that there's nothing as invisible as a memorial, where you're not, and when you attend a memorial, do you think in a certain way because you feel obliged to think in a certain way? So in a sense, it disrupts your everyday. There's another argument that Jennifer A. Jordan posits. She says, you can walk through Rosenstrasse and you can not notice it. So you can engage with the past, but it has to be a choice, I think, to engage with the past in that particular street. You might just be, disinterested and opt not to. And I suppose that's also a case of that's your right to choose whether to engage in the past. We can't force you to. No one can force you to confront the past. It's a matter of individual agency, I think.
Great, thank you. And my other question related, I guess, to you mentioned the GDR and its particular almost displacement from the site in a way. Could you elaborate on that some more? Because I know I read your article from German Life and Letters that you published last year, in which you talked about kind of an enthusiastic support for using memorialization to leverage kind of foreign policy, so to speak, as the GDR. So yeah. At the time, but what do you see as this kind of displacement at the moment of the GDR, or the former GDR, obviously, but can you elaborate on that?
Yes, certainly. I mean, just to sort of point a few things, so to point out what you're saying about the sort of the wider context of the GDR in the 1980s, was effectively a bankrupt state, and it was sort of in hoc trying to get money to survive. And so Mario Kessler in particular, and also Paula Doherty argue that basically the East German state was going to America, and other nations to try and get money, and it used engaging with its Jewish past as leverage for that, because previously sort of narratives of the Jewish past have been subsumed under sort of the communist heritage of the state and sort of communist resistance. But cynically, the state then made overtures towards the Jewish community and started investing in sort of engaging with the Jewish past, running memorial competitions and so on, in attempt to look good when they went to the States to ask for money. So it was a very cynical ploy on the part of the state. And I just think that, and obviously it's enabled various memorials to happen, and this one in particular. But I know many memorials at the time that were in sort of preparation in the former GDR then didn't end up being installed post-unification. So I suppose there's questions why Rosenstrasse captures the imagination perhaps more than others. But I just think potentially, there's so much going on in that site that we're losing, that we can't necessarily maintain all of the histories, or make those visible, and so the GDR is being lost. And it's not just actually in memorialization that we find this, because I've looked at the various different representations of this protest, and there's what we call a popular history account, and the first version was written as a sort of piece of young adult literature, so aimed for sort of like older teens to early adults. And the way this narrative was constructed differs from its later version. So it talked about another resistance group who were involved, very much a left-leaning, the Herbert Baum-Gruppe, very much a kind of communist-associated resistance group. And they talked about the various different activities that they did. And then as time went on and this book was republished and it was then rewritten as a sort of history with the story attached, this narrative changed around this particular group. The sort of the East German dimension was sort of lost, and it became much more like the narrative of the White Rose. It just talked about the pamphleteering, and it parallels the sort of the narrative of the vice-lords of the Munich student resistance group, who were caught and executed just before this protest actually took place. So I have, it's just my sort of sense as I'm looking at things that the Nazi past and the Jewish past is being quite rightly remembered, but the Jewish past, or the GDR past rather, is being kind of forgotten. That a lot of the memories of Rosenstrasse come from the GDR. It was activity in the GDR that meant that commemoration happened. The fact that we have an annual ceremony is down to the then East German Jewish community, who initiated this and held out the proverbial olive branch across the Berlin Wall to their West German counterparts and invited them over to what was then East Berlin. And this ceremony has gained and built ever since.
Thank you. It's very interesting also because of what you said of that displacement, mirrors other kind of practices as well, of how do you kind of, I guess, write a commemoration history